Magic the Gathering has been deemed by many as the most complicated game on the planet. That being said, in a lot of ways, it has become simpler in recent years. Card text in the early days was not standardized and often read like someone just trying to explain what a card did in their own words. As the game has grown and evolved, its creators have done an excellent job of condensing a lot of the card effects and standardizing the language used to make it much more intuitive and easier to understand. However, though the what of card effects has become easier to understand, the question of when remains one of the most challenging aspects of the game for new to intermediate players. This is especially true in the ever-surging format of Commander, where players often have to navigate the turns of 3 or more opponents in addition to their own. In this video, we will explore the rules and strategy of timing in Magic the Gathering. Part 1. The rules of timing. Instant versus sorcery speed, the stack, and priority. Before we can discuss timing from a strategic angle, we must first establish when you are able to do what, in accordance to the rules of the game. There are a few factors that dictate this, beginning with the difference between sorcery speed and instant speed. The following actions can be defined as sorcery speed actions: casting sorcery spells, casting any permanent spell that does not have flash, playing lands, and activating abilities that specify that they can only be activated anytime you could cast a sorcery. The criteria for performing sorcery speed actions are as follows. It must be your turn, you must be in a main phase, and the stack must be empty. The stack is technically more about order of operations than it is about timing, but the way it functions is critical to determining the ideal timing for the actions you can perform. Simply put, the stack can be thought of as just that, a physical stack of spells and abilities that go onto the stack from bottom to top, and then resolve from top to bottom. Here's a simple example. Player 1 has priority on their own turn and attempts to abrade Player 2's Caged Sun. Player 1 has put abrade on the stack and passed priority. Player 2 would like to counterspell the abrade, so once priority has been passed to Player 2, they can cast Counterspell. With abrade on the bottom of the stack and Counterspell on top of it, Player 1 once again begins a new round of priority before the stack begins to resolve. Player 1 would like to use Fork to make sure that the abrade happens, and they actually have 2 ways to do so. Since Fork can copy any spell on the stack, Player 1 has the option here to either fork their own abrade before it gets countered, and once again target the Caged Sun with the copy, or they can also fork the counterspell and use their copy of Counterspell to counter Player 2's original Counterspell. The reason that either of these options works is because in both circumstances, Player 1's fork will be at the top of the stack, so whichever spell Player 1 chooses to copy will resolve before the original abrade and counterspell, since the stack resolves from top to bottom, essentially in the opposite order that actions are put onto the stack. In this example, we mentioned priority, so let's take a look at what that is and how it affects game situations. In an empty stack situation, whoever's turn it is will have priority. In this circumstance, they are known as the active player. This means that no other player can perform a game action until the active player puts a spell or ability on the stack. And even once they do so, the round of priority to respond to that spell or ability begins with the active player, meaning they get the first chance to respond to their own actions. Let's go back to our previous example to see how this could change the outcome of a situation depending on what order the same spells are used. Let's say that instead of passing priority after casting their abrade, Player 1 decides they want to destroy Player 2's smokestack as well. Using the same 2 spells as they did in the first example, Player 1 casts abrade targeting the Caged Sun. And then with first priority after abrade goes onto the stack, Player 1 casts their fork targeting the abrade with the intent of using the copy of abrade to target the smokestack. After casting fork, Player 1 then passes priority to Player 2, who now has a great opportunity for a 2-for-1 move. With both of player 1's spells on the stack, player 2 can now cast Counterspell targeting the Abrade. Since the Counterspell resolves first as a result of being the last spell to be put on the stack, not only does it remove the Abrade from the stack, it also causes player 1's fork to fizzle, meaning it does nothing, since the fork's target is no longer on the stack to be copied as the fork tries to resolve. So instead of losing one or two of their artifacts, player 2 actually loses neither. Before moving on, I'd like to address a couple of common timing errors that I see a lot of newer players make in regards to how priority works. They are fairly similar, with one being a slightly bigger no-no than the other. Let's start with that bigger no-no, jumping priority in an empty stack situation. Let's drop in on a commander pod for an example of how I often see this error committed. Player 1 casts Sadistic Hypnotist. Player 2 sees that the Hypnotist's ability can only be used at sorcery speed and decides to cast Lightning Bolt targeting the Hypnotist before player 1 gets a chance to activate its ability. Now, player 2 is technically correct about the fact that if they cast Bolt targeting the Hypnotist, that player 1 cannot activate Hypnotist's sorcery speed ability in response. However, where player 2 is mistaken is that when the Hypnotist was cast, if it's allowed to resolve as the last spell off of the stack, then player 1 now has priority as the active player. This means that player 2 cannot cast their Lightning Bolt or perform any other game action until player 1 either puts a spell or ability on the stack and passes priority, or just passes priority in an attempt to change phases. This means that if player 1 wants to immediately activate their Hypnotist, they can do so once before anybody can make any attempt to interfere with it. The other mistake along these lines that I often see is jumping people in priority in response to something on the stack. Going back to player 1 casting Hypnotist. Let's say that player 4 also really hates the idea of Hypnotist even resolving. Immediately after player 1 announces that they are casting Hypnotist, player 4 says, "Yeah, no, I'm counterspelling that," before players 2 and 3 have even had a chance to respond. Remember, the order in which people can respond is in turn order starting from the active player. The reason I say that this is slightly less egregious is that usually in this circumstance, players 2 and 3 are happy to not have to expend their own resources to deal with a problem. So even though player 4 jumped them in priority, and they do have the option to insist that priority gets rewound back to them to respond first, players 2 and 3 will often just say, "Oh yeah, that's cool, I forfeit my priority," because they see that the problem is going to be dealt with. In that case, not only has player 4 committed a gameplay error, but they've also potentially committed a strategic blunder, since it's possible that players 2 or 3 could have had a way to stop the Hypnotist before player 4 jumped the gun and burned their own counterspell. This is a good segue into the strategic elements of timing. Part 2. Macro timing and strategy. Great. Now that we've covered when you can act and respond, let's talk about when you should make your moves. One of the earliest pieces of advice that many new Magic players receive is something along the lines of, wait as long as possible to do your thing. To put it another way, don't do something until you either have to or you get the ideal opportunity to. Let's go back to our pod to see some situations we can analyze. Player 1 is now pretty pissed that the overeager player 4 countered their Hypnotist. Player 1 has a Doomblade that they would very much like to use on player 4's Ancient Silver Dragon. But player 1 understands that firing back now isn't the wisest choice. Player 4 still has 4 islands untapped and a handful of cards, and player 1 suspects that player 4 may have more counter magic. Player 1 also notices that player 4's Kefnet the Mindful has an activated ability requiring exactly 4 mana, and can reasonably assume that if not forced to use that 4 mana by the time player 3 is passing turn, then player 4 will be very likely to tap out to activate the Kefnet, which would be the perfect opportunity to Doomblade the Dragon. It's also not lost on player 1 that players 2 and 3 may very well also be worried about the Ancient Silver Dragon, and either one of them could have a board wipe or a spot removal to deal with the dragon before player 4's turn. Even though it's tempting to fire back at player 4 and get revenge for your hypnotist, the strategically sound decision is to wait and see if someone else does your dirty work for you first. Here's another example. Later in the game, player 2 decides to make their move. With a board full of goblin tokens and a Havoc Jester, player 2 plays a Goblin Bombardment. Nobody has any counter magic, but player 3 has a disenchant. Player 3 knows that they can't try to disenchant the bombardment until player 2 activates it at least once, or does anything else first, so they wait for the moment to strike. With priority and a shit ton of firepower, player 2 decides it's time to start blasting, so they sacrifice their first goblin to the bombardment, which also immediately puts a Jester trigger on the stack. This was player 2's test shot, so with the 2 abilities on the stack, they pass priority. Player 3 now springs into action. Let's nip this in the bud right now, player 3 says, as they cast Disenchant, targeting the bombardment. Well, now player 3 has kicked the hornet's nest and must pay the iron price. Because see, Goblin Bombardment doesn't carry the same timing restrictions as Sadistic Hypnotist. Bombardment can be activated at instant speed with no cost except for the creature you have to sack. Now this is why you will hear me say time and time again that instant speed free sack outlets are some of the most powerful cards in Commander, because they are almost impossible to interrupt once their engine is up and running. So with player 3's heroic disenchant on the stack, player 2 sacks another goblin and specifies that they are holding priority, then sacks another goblin, then another, and another, and another, with every bombardment activation and every Jester trigger aimed directly at player 3's face, until player 3 is facing death with disenchant still on the stack. But wait, player 3 confidently exclaims, I also have a naturalize. I'd like to fire that off as soon as I can to interrupt all of this. You can't, player 2 explains. I can hold priority in response to each activation or trigger of mine and keep sacking before you have a chance to do anything. And even if I did decide to pause and give you a chance to respond, I can just start sacking again in response to your naturalize. Player 2 is absolutely right here, and this just goes to show you, no matter how clever or correct you are with your timing, there are going to be situations where you inevitably are just totally helpless to stop what someone else is doing. In our final example, we're in the end game and it's come down to players 1 and 2. Player 2 still has the Jester bombardment engine online, but it's running out of gas, and on top of that, they're only at 5 life. This is particularly alarming because player 1, who's here for the memes, has a colossal Dreadmaw in play representing lethal to player 2. So player 2 taps out to cast the only blocker in their hand, a Storm Splitter, and passes turn. Player 1 very much feels that if they don't kill player 2 right now, they are doomed. With a 6/6 trample on board and no cards in hand, player 1 moves to draw step and rips a murder. But is one spot removal spell enough to secure the win here? Take a moment to consider how you would play this. Seeing that player 2 only has 1 card left in hand and is showing some token production on the board with a Cur Keep and a Den of the Bugbear, player 1 figures that player 2 would probably prefer to keep the Jester and throw the Storm Splitter under the Dreadmaw to survive combat. Thinking of it from player 1's situation, if you murder the Storm Splitter in your main phase and then move to combat and attack with the Dreadmaw, player 2 still has the Jester to block with. Obviously, they would prefer to keep the Jester, but if it's between losing the Jester or dying, clearly they'll block with it if they have no other choice. Along the same logic, if you hold up removal through combat, player 2 is very unlikely to double block because of how valuable the Jester is to them. Meaning that the most logical assumption is that if you attack before using murder, then player 2 will block with only the Storm Splitter. If that's the case, then they've fallen right into your trap. Because of the way Trample works, if you wait until after blockers are declared to murder the Storm Splitter, then all of Dreadmaw's damage tramples over, because when it comes time to deal that damage, your Dreadmaw sees 0 toughness that it has to trample over before dealing the remaining damage to defending player. So the difference between winning now and letting player 2 get another turn to potentially kill you was the timing of knowing the best situation for firing off your murder. Well, that about wraps up this video. I hope you found these examples helpful, and I hope the rules clarification helps you make the right decisions going forward, not only strategically, but technically. Magic is a hell of a game. It's really complicated, but that makes winning and performing well that much more rewarding. Just remember, you're always going to make mistakes. It's nearly impossible to play the perfect game of Commander just because you're almost never working with perfect information. You just have to time things right, make the decisions that give you the best odds of having the desired outcome, and above all, just have fun with it. When things work out, you'll feel great. When things don't, it's going to be a bummer, but you could find lessons to learn within the context of what you did and when you did it. Thanks for tuning in for this video about timing. If this was helpful to you, please give me a like, give me a subscribe. This is a channel that we are actively trying to grow to help new to intermediate players, and every little bit you can do is very helpful to me. I appreciate it. Until next time, thanks for coming to the Highlanders Workshop, and I will catch you later.